We're going to be talking about clairvoyant investigations into the structure of matter. And this is a very important, at least in my mind, theosophical topic, because science is a very important part of Theosophy. And if you look at the secret doctrine and look at the subtitle of the title page, it says the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. And Blavatsky wrote, the aim of this work may be thus stated to show that nature is not a fortuitous concurrence of atoms, and to show that the occult side of nature has never been approached by the science of modern civilization. Now, clairvoyance is extrasensory perception of visual images. And we all studied clairvoyance as kids when we read Superman comics, because he was the first clairvoyant that we became familiar with. But the people who we're going to be talking about today is not Superman, but Besant and Charles Leadbeater, who in 1895 made some very unusual clairvoyant discoveries about the structure of atoms. There's a clairvoyant technique called clairvoyant magnification, which was described only 2,400 years ago by Patanjali, somehow using Kundalini energy. I can't tell you anything about that, where they were actually able to see into atoms and sort of climb around inside of them and investigate them. Very magical stuff, it seems like. And the atoms they saw clairvoyantly in 1895 had a complex internal structure. And I have here a number of atoms of different elements showing some of the structure that they drew or had drawn for them by artists who were drawing these structures at their instruction. Now, in 1895, science did not recognize any internal structure of atoms. They used Isaac Newton's science, and he said that it seems probable to me that God in the beginning formed matter in solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, movable particles. And that was what science was believing in 1895. Let's look at the two different clairvoyants who we're going to be talking about. Charles Leadbeater is an Englishman. He was the presiding bishop of the Liberal Catholic Church, authored 40 books, lectured worldwide, involved in the development of co-masonry, leader in the Theosophical Society, noted psychic, and a very conservative upper-class Tory. And his colleague, Annie Besant, was exactly the opposite. Also English, she was a social activist, get out on the soapbox on the street corner and preach type of person. She was all for education for poor people. She wrote a pamphlet on birth control, which you just didn't do in Victorian times. She was against sweatshop labor. She helped organize the famous Material Strike, turn of the 20th century. She was a friend of George Bernard Shaw and other radicals. Later on in life, she moved to colonial India and joined the Home Rule movement in the India National Congress, where she worked with Nehru and Gandhi and became president of that Congress in 1917. And of course, the object of that Congress was to kick Great Britain out of India and make India free. She joined the Theosophical Society in 1889 and worked her way up to president in 1907. She did not realize she had psychic abilities until much later on in life. And Leadbeater helped her develop these. And somehow they got along well enough together to do this work. I don't know how they ever did it. Just absolutely opposite personalities. But they were working with Kutumi, Master Kutumi, who taught clairvoyant magnification to both of them. And Kutumi was the person who urged the founding of the Theosophical Society in 1875 in order to introduce Eastern spirituality to the West, as you well know. He wrote in 1892 that science can know nothing of the nature of atoms. He wouldn't have asked Leadbeater and Besant to do clairvoyant investigation unless he knew that they were going to see something important. So I think it's pretty obvious that he already was aware of the structure of atoms, or he wouldn't have had them do that work, and he wouldn't have written this in the Mahatma letters that science can know nothing about the nature of atoms. Besant and Leadbeater examined samples of elements that they got from various places, many of them from a museum in Dresden, Germany, where there was a good mineralogical collection. And I have here on the right listed some of the more common elements that they were looking at. There were, if I'm not mistaken, there were 179 elements that were known to science at that time. And this is not all of them. It's a good sampling of them, though. And they did their clairvoyant investigations whenever they could between 1895 and 1933. They both had very busy schedules, and they were traveling all over the world, and they weren't in the same place at the same time very often. But when they were, they got together and they got into a room with stenographers who took down everything that they said, and artists who were drawing what they saw, their direction. And then all the data was assembled and archived by Dasa. Dasa was a Sri Lankan and a protege of Leadbeater's. He was educated at Cambridge University, did graduate work at the University of Pavia in Italy. He was primarily a linguist, but he was very well read in the sciences. And he was a well-published educator and a theosophist, and became president of the Theosophical Society towards the end of his life. Now, the observations that Leadbeater and Besant made were published from time to time between 1895 and 1933 in 9 different journal articles. And these articles are available. They're online. You can pull them up pretty easily. They also published a book summarizing their findings up between 1895 and 1908 in a book called Occult Chemistry. And this book was then expanded in 1951 after the deaths of both Besant and Leadbeater by Dasa. And he put all of their occult information, clairvoyant investigations, into this book, which is available on Amazon if you want, or the Quest bookstore, and at a pretty reasonable price. Now, in their investigations, there was a small object in every atom, no matter what kind of element it was. Here are shown boron and nitrogen and uranium, and you see these little dots scattered about in these different looking drawings of different elements. But these dots are all the same. And these small objects were called ultimate physical atoms by Leadbeater and Besant, or sometimes Leadbeater would use the Sanskrit word for atom, which was anu. with the emphasis on the ooh. And they came in two different forms, which were really mirror images of each other. And they called them positive and negative. This is what they look like. And they were usually found in triplets, in groups of three, as shown in the uppermost part of the illustration here, where you had three ultimate physical atoms attached by lines of force, which are drawn in there. And then in the middle part of the illustration, you'll see that these groups of three would link together. And eventually these groups that were linked together would form the atoms shown down there in the bottom. We'll get back to these linkages a little later on. One thing that they found out, or that they observed very quickly, was that the atoms, or most of them, had the form of any one of 7 different shapes: spikes, dumbbells, tetrahedrons, cubes, octahedrons, bars, or stars, they call them. There were only 5 elements that did not fit into these shapes. Now, they also found out that these elements, well, the valences of these elements were already known by chemists. A valence is the number of points on an atom where it can bond with other atoms to form molecules. And the periodic table of elements that we use so much today is based upon the valences of the elements. And it turns out that spikes and dumbbells had a valence of 1, tetrahedrons of 2 or 6, cubes of 3 or 5, octahedrons of 4, bars of 8, and stars, no valences. They were the inert gases. And so these elements, as they saw them, were clustered in different parts of the periodic table, depending upon the valence of the elements. And so this gave them a clue right off the bat in 1895 that they were dealing with something that had something to do with science. Another thing they did, I guess Besant did a lot of this, they counted the ultimate physical atoms, UPAs, in each element. In hydrogen, they found 18 of them. In carbon, they found 216 of them. In iron, 1,008 of them. In gold, 3,546 of them. And these numbers were consistent from atom to atom in the samples of elements they were looking at. Now, if you take the number of UPAs of the atoms and divide them by 18, shown there in the center, you get a value shown on the right, which is very close to the atomic weight that was known by science of these elements. For hydrogen, it was 1. For carbon, it was, they came out with 11.9 instead of 12. For iron, it was 55.5, and so on. And so this gave them another indication that what they were dealing with had some sort of a scientific basis, both the valence and the atomic weight. Furthermore, they were working with these examples or samples of elements, and the samples were not necessarily pure samples. They had contaminants. And Leadbeater and Besant were able to find out that some of these contaminants were unknown elements to science. In 1909, they described two of them that they called alunium and marcurium, which science didn't know anything about until scientists discovered them much later and called them promethium and technetium. And then there were two others there that they found in 1932, which turned out to be new elements, and scientists later found them. So that was another indication that they were onto something scientific here. But the really interesting thing about their work, I think, has to do with the UPAs. Now, each of these ultimate physical atoms, or anus, were made up of 10 whorls. And it's kind of hard to see it all with all the whorls in there. So let's redraw it with just 3 of those whorls instead of all 10. And so if you can take each whorl, and it's sort of like a piece of cotton clothesline. Let's say it's about 20 feet long and the ends are tied together, and you could make a big circle out of the clothesline, and then you can lop the different sides of the clothesline over each other and end up with shapes much like these whorls. Now, another thing is that each of these whorls is coiled like the binder of a spiral notebook or screen door spring. And actually, it's not, they're whorled not just one time, but and not just 2 times or 3 times, but 7 times. So these are extremely complex structures. There are 1,680 gyres in each whorl. If you're just counting the outside whorl or coil itself. Each coil, by the way, they call a spirilla. So there's very precise structure to these things. And this is true in every kind of element that they looked at. And they looked at all of them. And they also found that energy passes sequentially through these many UPAs from one to another, emerging initially from some unknown place, a fourth spatial dimension, and eventually returning to that dimension. And the energy doesn't flow right down the center like is shown in the diagram here, but actually flows along the whorls. Now, when Leadbeater was first looking at these things, he had a stenographer there, and he got pretty excited about it. And you don't think of a conservative Tory like Leadbeater being excited, but by gosh, he did get excited. Look at what the stenographer wrote down. The one I've got is now on the side. That's interesting. If I look at it on the end, yes, the enlarged end. Yes, there it is. It's coming up clearly. It's the anu. I've got one anu. It's made us by really. And if I go to the large end and look down, I get the impression of gyration. It's clockwise in this particular one. The spinning is immense. The shape is maintained all the time. It swells and goes down like a centrifugal force makes it swell in. It's pulsing. It's lighted. It's brilliantly lighted. Sort of sounds like the script from an Indiana Jones movie. But nonetheless, this is what happens when you discover something new in science or clairvoyance, either one. And if you look there on the insert that I put in on the left, you will see the order of coiling. Have a spring, which is once coiled, and then it's coiled around itself for a second order. And then on the right is a drawing by Leadbeater showing the 4th, fifth, sixth, and seventh order of coiling of one of these worlds. And it gets pretty complex. What's interesting, though, is that in that seventh order, the very finest order does not consist of something which is attached like a wire on a spring. Instead, it consists of 7 bubbles in space. These are bubbles of energy, which are confined by something outside of them, some sort of ether, which is keeping them in place. And they made some sample counts on quite a few of these and found out that there are 1.38 billion bubbles per whorl. So again, tremendous structure on these whorls, on these ultimate physical atoms. Now, Hinduism says that matter is an illusion, it's Maya. Well, in that picture up there on top, you have bubbles in an ether, and this is what we call matter. Leadbeater said, emptiness has become solidity and solidity emptiness. The anu can scarcely be said to be a thing. It's formed from the flow of life force known to Theosophists as Fohat, the form of which all physical plane forces are differentiated. When Fohat digs holes in space, the anu appears. Max Planck won the Nobel Prize in 1918 for his proposal of the quantum theory of physics. He said that matter is not solid. There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration. That's about the same thing Leadbeater was saying, you know? Except Planck said it quite a bit later. Leadbeater said it in 1895, and Planck said it in the early 1900s. Had anybody else seen these UPAs? Yes. There had been a book published in 1878 by Edwin Babbitt, who drew a UPA. His drawing shown here on the right. Emanuel Swedenborg described matter consisting of closed vortexes of energy spiraling at infinite speed. That sounds like a UPA to me. And there were others who have also seen this. So these UPAs were not just the figment of the imagination of Leadbeater and Besant. Others had seen them. And of course, we can assume that the Katoomey and other adepts had seen them as well. Science, though, believed that atoms lacked any structure until 1912, when Ernest Rutherford, a British physicist, came up with the idea that an atom consisted of an atomic nucleus, which was orbited by electrons. Rutherford's atom was counterintuitive and just as crazy as clairvoyant atoms were that Leadbeater was describing. If the nucleus was a soccer ball in size, its electron would orbit 4.1 miles away, which meant that anything which was really solid and hard consisted almost entirely of space. And so this is wild stuff. In 1920, Rutherford discovered that the nucleus was not solid. It consisted of much smaller objects that he called protons. And then in 1932, James Chadwick discovered that half of those protons weren't protons, they were neutrons with a different electrical charge, but essentially the same structure. And in 1964, Murray Gell-Mann proposed that each of these protons and neutrons actually had structure to it, which he showed down here in the bottom of the diagram. 3 different balls, ups and downs, U's and D's, which were actually positive and negative. The proton had 2 of these that were positive, 1 negative, and the neutron just the opposite, 2 negatives and 1 positive. And he called these objects quarks, which just goes to prove how poetic physicists are. I'm being facetious. So now we have to reconcile atoms of clairvoyance with the atoms of science. The atoms of clairvoyance on the left, those of science on the right. How are we going to do this? Well, there's a graduate student from Great Britain, Stephan Phillips, who went to study theoretical physics at the University of California, and he also happened to be a theosophist. And when he heard about the clairvoyant investigations of Leadbeater and Besant, he got very interested. And he spent his entire career studying their work and elaborating on it. And he's published 3 books, including this one here called The Extrasensory Perception of Quarks and Superstrings. That I think is still available at Quest Bookstore and on Amazon. He soon found out that the UPA shown here on the left is one of the a constituent of quarks, and the quark, each quark is shown here by a circle with 3 UPAs in it, and the electrical charge from each UPA indicated for protons and for neutrons. So this was a big step forward to show that there was really a good correlation between clairvoyant investigations of Leadbeater and Besant with atomic physics. Now let's get back to the diagram that I showed earlier about how the UPAs, the ultimate physical particles, are usually, they usually occur in triplets, in threes, which are connected by lines of force. Well, each of these triplets is a quark. So really, Leadbeater and Besant were discovering quarks 69 years earlier than physicists did. Here's a drawing of a hydrogen atom, which Leadbeater put in his book, first book on occult chemistry. And you can see the 3 UPAs, ultimate physical atoms there, in each quark, and the quarks then united into 1 proton and 1 neutron. But wait, there's something wrong here. If you know anything about chemistry at all, you know that hydrogen atoms only have 1 proton and no neutron. So what gives? Well, Phillips figured this one out also, that when you do clairvoyant investigations, you use your mind to slow down the motion of these ultimate physical particles. And when you slow down the motion, they collapse in pairs. It happens in hydrogen, it happens in every other element. And this is really the same thing as what Duplicate slide there. What Werner Heisenberg said in 1927 in his so-called uncertainty principle, where the observation affects the behavior of subatomic particles. And this clairvoyant observation would nicely explain his uncertainty principle. Now, if we go back up to this slide again and count the number of ultimate physical particles in a collapsed hydrogen atom, we get 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. Now, remember back when we were looking at atomic weights, we took the number of ultimate physical particles, divided them by 18, and got the atomic weight. Actually, more accurately, the atomic number, but the atomic weight and the atomic number are usually the same thing, or just about. And so that's where the number 18 comes in on this. Phillips figured that one out also. And then also, these quarks fit nicely into what's known as string theory. Now, string theory is a mathematical production by physicists, and not all physicists believe in it, but most do. It has not been proven yet by accelerators and other experimentation, but mathematically it fits very nicely. Some scientific drawings are models of quarks are shown here on the left. And then on the right, there are some clairvoyant strings that were drawn in 1895 by Leadbeater. And they look just about the same. At the end of each string is a UPA. And lines of force then become the strings. So it looks pretty close here that what they were seeing clairvoyantly fits very nicely with how physicists conceive of the string theory. It's not absolutely proven yet by any means, but nonetheless, it's very suggestive. Now, supposedly these strings appear in compactified space. What is compactified space? Well, it's space where you have more than 3 spatial dimensions. Artists like Picasso have tried to draw this way, showing more than 3 dimensions. Mathematicians, as shown on the left, have drawn models of compactified space, but there on the lower right is compactified space as shown in UPA, ultimate physical particle, as drawn by Leadbeater. It seems that Leadbeater and Besant were actually working with compactified space, although they were not calling it that at the time, but they were dealing with that concept well before physicists and mathematicians got involved. Now, many of you have read the work of Geoffrey Hodson, who was the New Zealand Theosophist of a couple of generations ago, who's pretty well known. He also clairvoyantly saw UPAs, ultimate physical particles. And he described a mist of particles spinning around UPAs in 1959. Phillips identified these as strings comprising Higgs particles, which he claimed united the UPAs into quarks. Now we're really getting into some deep theoretical stuff here, and this has not been proven by any means, but nonetheless, it's well worth considering. Peter Higgs theorized these Higgs particles in 1964, 5 years after Hodgson observed them clairvoyantly. And it's made a big splash in the news media, and the news people called them God particles because they were the particles that gave mass to matter, weight in other words, and they were found throughout the universe, and perhaps constitute some sort of ether. Our physicists aren't ready to say that yet, but these particles have been found by an accelerator since they were first theorized by Higgs in 1964. Here's something else that Leadbeater and Besant came up with. They discovered what we know now as isotopes. They discovered this clairvoyantly. They discovered that some samples that they were working with of some, but not all, elements had extra UPAs in them. And they reported these. And it turns out that these had extra neutrons in them. These were, and they're called isotopes. And one of the first ones they worked with was the element neon. Gives you neon gas that lights up neon tubing. And they found some element or some samples of neon with extra UPAs or extra neutrons. Well, this was picked up pretty quickly after Leadbeater and Besant published on this by Francis Aston, the physicist, who in 1908 described what Leadbeater and Besant were calling meta-neon. And he refused to acknowledge the clairvoyant discovery and the name that he used when confronted by Jinnarajah Dasa. He said he just didn't want to have anything to do with Theosophy. But anyhow, we can also credit clairvoyant investigations to the discovery of isotopes. Okay, science ignores clairvoyant discoveries. Why? Phillips says that deep-rooted cultural attitudes towards the occult and the paranormal make most scientists reluctant to risk their careers by endorsing research that confirms the existence of extrasensory perception. Therefore, they ignore these clairvoyant studies. Max Planck wrote, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it." That's rather interesting, I think. And I think Planck really had it right. Well, why is this occult science so important, all these clairvoyant investigations? Well, first of all, it's linking spirituality and Western science, just as Blavatsky hoped would happen when she wrote The Secret Doctrine. Second, it gives credence to Kutumi and other Mahatmas and adepts. It shows that those adepts really knew a lot more than we did. And therefore, we better read the Mahatma letters again and take into serious consideration the things that they said. And third, it confirms the validity of Theosophy, because Theosophy is based on the teachings of the Mahatmas, both in the Mahatma letters and all the teachings of Blavatsky and some of the other early Theosophists by these Mahatmas. Therefore, we wouldn't have any Theosophy at all unless the Mahatmas hadn't come along, and now we can use these clairvoyant investigations to see that absolutely that these Mahatmas were correct, and what they are telling us is the true stuff. So I think this is why occult science is important. Now, occult science anticipated other Western science discoveries. Pablo Sender wrote a very nice article on this, but I'll just summarize it here. The Mahatmas said in letters and other publications that the universe expands and contracts well before science did, and that atoms are in ceaseless motion well before science did, and that space is full and not void well before Einstein did, and the sun consists of electromagnetic forces, and that planets are formed by the accretion of plasma, and that gravitation is not an inherent property of matter. Again, a very important constituent of Einstein's relativity theory. So there's a lot of science besides just clairvoyant investigations of atoms that make up the science that the Mahatmas, the adepts, Fatumi, and people in Moria have told us. Phillips has done a lot of work in the sacred geometry of the Kabbalah and of Hindu texts, and claims that they are mathematical expressions of occult chemistry. And you can go to his website and get explanations of it. They're pretty detailed and complex. Phillips and I published a little article in Quest trying to get American Theosophists to get interested in this topic. And indeed, I've been able to give a few talks around the country on this topic, but it needs to be publicized a lot more, I think. I want to end with a quotation from Sherlock Holmes, because it has real pertinence to the sort of work that Leadbeater and Besant have done. He said, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Wait a minute, Sherlock Holmes was a fictional character created by A. Conan Doyle, the author. But did you realize that A. Conan Doyle was a theosophist? That's what I got to tell you tonight. So we'll end the slideshow here and I guess take a break, and then I will be very happy to entertain questions and comments. Now we'll stop share. Okay. So I hand it over to